Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies, and in this episode, we're going to look at some tips and tricks for how to build resin and metal models. I remember when I got my first wargaming model kit, and that was the Space Marine Land Speeder, back in the days of Rogue Trader. Back then, in case you weren't around, pretty well every model came in a blister pack, and there really weren't many models that were made in plastic. So the land speeder in those days was all metal, and it didn't have a lot of parts. I was really excited to get it on the table and get my Space Marines blasting orcs, Eldar, and other aliens with this awesome piece of technology. But there was a problem. I had never built a metal model before, and what seemed like a fairly straightforward task from a fairly simple assembly diagram turned into a special kind of hell. You see, even equipped with the proper superglue, building a metal model requires skills that I just didn't know about at the time. Well, now I'm 45 years old and quite a bit more experience when it comes to building models, and over the years, I've learned some tips that have really helped with some of the tougher model builds. And this, of course, includes any model where you're trying to fasten metal parts together or metal and resin parts together. These days, plastic kits are a dime a dozen, and they're a lot easier to build. But sometimes you just have to go old school and build a metal and resin hybrid model kit. So, with this video, I'd like to show you some of the tips I've picked up over time. This, of course, isn't a comprehensive list, but hopefully there's some techniques in here you're not aware of that'll make your model building skills that much better or help you out when you're getting frustrated with your builds.
Resin and metal models tend not to come on sprues like plastic kits, but you still need to clean them up. So I always recommend starting with a fresh blade and then looking at the model very carefully. You want to locate spots where the metal hasn't formed correctly or the resin hasn't formed correctly, and to carve off the offending parts. This is sometimes referred to as flashing, and it's usually caused on metal models where extra metal has seeped between parts of the mold, or where there are vent holes in the mold that have filled up with metal as the model cools. Once you've searched these down, you can go ahead and cut them off using a knife or using a pair of clippers, and sometimes it's necessary to use a file. Certain areas can come out of the mold fairly rough and might ruin the look of your model, so just go ahead and file those down. When you've got these details sorted out, now it's time to look towards actually assembling the model. I always recommend that you dry fit the model. That is, you take the pieces and you put them together to test to see how well they're fitting. If you have any gaps or issues, you may need to get the file back out and smooth down more areas or slightly modify the parts in order to make sure they fit together. Always make sure you do this though before you get out the glue. With the parts now trimmed and cleaned up, it's time to move on to the next step, and that'll involve washing the parts off. I do this by just taking some warm water, putting a couple drops of dish soap in it, and then submerging the parts in it. The parts of resin and metal models often have an oily film on the outside from a chemical used to help release them from the mold. Obviously, your paint is going to have a hard time sticking to this, so you need to wash it off first. I let them soak for 15 or 20 minutes, and then I get out a ratty old but clean brush and rub each of the parts down to try to get any of the release agent out of any of the crevices or cracks. Once this is finished, I lay out some paper towel, pat the models dry, and leave them to dry overnight. Alternatively, if you're in a bit of a rush or you want to kickstart the drying process, and you have an airbrush, you can just run it without any chemicals in it or paint in it and just dry the models off that way. Now you're almost ready for assembly, but there's one more thing you need to do. With resin or metal models, when you're gluing the parts together, the surface is often too smooth to leave a sufficient area to bond. You can help this out by taking out your file again and roughing up any surfaces where large parts join. In this case, where the tracks meet the hull of the vehicle seems like a good spot because it'll be bearing a fair amount of weight. I use the file both sides, both the metal and the resin, just to rough up the surface a bit. I make sure that I blow off or remove any excess dust from the filing process, and now I'm ready to begin applying the glue. To bond the parts, I actually recommend two products. First is some sort of cyanoacrylic glue or super glue, and you can really use any type. There are some thinner body ones and some gel body ones. I prefer something somewhere in the middle, although that's personal preference. The other product I recommend is some sort of super glue accelerant. There are different kinds, but all of them are extremely useful.
Super glue accelerant, of course, isn't strictly required. You can take your parts and hold them together like some sort of model builder's yoga pose for half an hour while you wait for the glue to become tacky, and then leave the model set aside for another couple hours while you wait for the glue to dry rock hard. Or get some super glue accelerant, put your parts together with the glue, spray it with a little accelerant, wait 10 seconds, and it'll be bonded rock hard as though you had left the glue on its own to dry for hours. Do yourself a favor, go down to the friendly local game store and get some super glue accelerant. You can thank me later.
Now all you need to do is take your super glue and put a very thin layer of it on the surfaces you want to join. Less is more in this case. And press the two parts together. Take the super glue accelerant, spray it into the join, and just let that dry. In about 10 to 30 seconds, you'll have a solid join that's as good as you can get. With your model assembled, it's now time to prime it. And usually with a plastic model, I would use any acrylic primer, usually a Vallejo brand, and apply it with my airbrush. But when it comes to metal and resin models, I don't really suggest you use an acrylic airbrush primer. Instead, you should probably use a regular spray can primer from the hardware store. Just make sure you've got one ahead of time that won't damage the materials you're working with. I generally prefer to use a matte black. Get the can out, and in a ventilated area, spray the model down with a couple coats.
There you have it, my tips and tricks for building resin and metal models. I hope they help you with your builds in the future. If you have any tips or tricks you'd like to add, make sure you put them in the comments below. It's a good idea to always share, and the model building community is always growing and benefiting from other people's knowledge. That's it for this episode. Thanks for watching. Remember, Miniature Landscape Hobbies features videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Please subscribe and press the bell button so you get immediate notification so you don't miss out. Thanks for watching, and until next time, remember to keep building life in miniature.